When we speak about the discovery of America, we cannot detach it from the broader story of the age of exploration. This was not a random accident in history. It was the culmination of centuries of human ambition, technological evolution, and the relentless push to know what lay beyond the horizon. The late 20th century was a time when Europe, emerging from the Middle Ages, was driven by a combination of necessity and desire. Necessity because trade routes to the east had become perilous and expensive after the fall of Constantinople, and desire because human beings have always been restless creatures, dissatisfied with the familiar and eager for the unknown. In that climate, men like Christopher Columbus were both products of their age and anomalies within it. The political landscape was shifting. Powerful kingdoms like Spain and Portugal were competing fiercely for dominance, not merely in warfare, but in the acquisition of trade influence and prestige. The rise of centralized monarchies meant that the resources of entire nations could now be directed toward ambitious ventures. At the same time, maritime technology was advancing, improved ship designs like the caravel, more accurate navigational instruments such as the astrolabe, and refined cartography all expanded the limits of what was possible. The oceans, which had once seemed vast and threatening, were beginning to feel like open corridors of opportunity. But it wasn't only technology and politics that propelled these journeys. It was an idea, a deep-seated belief that the world was larger than the maps suggested, and that beyond the known lay not just danger, but fortune. Columbus's conviction that one could reach the east by sailing west was both bold and flawed, but that's precisely what makes it remarkable. He didn't have perfect certainty. He had a vision strong enough to risk his life, his reputation, and his future. And that perhaps is one of the most enduring human traits, the willingness to step into uncertainty when the potential reward seems worth the peril. We often speak of the spirit of discovery as though it were an abstract virtue, but in truth, it's deeply intertwined with personal risk and societal ambition. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, didn't support Columbus out of pure curiosity. They saw a chance to elevate Spain's power, to outmaneuver Portugal, and to secure a monopoly on lucrative trade. Columbus himself was motivated not only by the promise of wealth, but by an almost spiritual drive to achieve something monumental. That mixture of self-interest, national, and idealism is not unique to the 20th century. It's a recurring pattern in the history of human progress. It's worth remembering that the voyage of Icién-Cibayurar was not guaranteed to succeed. The Atlantic was still largely mysterious to Europeans, filled with legends of sea monsters, endless voids, and unpredictable storms. To sail west with limited supplies and no confirmed destination required a blend of courage and stubbornness that few possessed. When the three ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set out from Palos de la Frontera, they carried not only sailors, but also the weight of countless expectations. Each mile they traveled into the unknown was a quiet defiance of fear. The road to discovery, therefore, wasn't just a straight line from Spain to a new land. It was paved with centuries of human development, ancient trade routes, earlier voyages along African coasts, the slow accumulation of navigational knowledge, and the willingness of leaders to stake their fortunes on a dream. Columbus's arrival in the Bahamas was the visible climax of a process that had been unfolding for generations. The true discovery was not only the land itself, but the realization that the known world was far smaller than reality. Yet there's a deeper truth here, one that stretches beyond history into something more philosophical. Great discoveries rarely happen in They are the product of countless small steps taken by people whose names are often forgotten. The sailors who learned to read the stars, the map makers who charted coastlines, the merchants who financed early voyages, all of them laid the groundwork for that moment when Columbus sighted land. In this sense, the discovery of America is a reminder that human achievement is both individual and collective. One man may be credited with the act, but many shoulders carried him to the edge of possibility. In thinking about that era, we should also recognize that discovery is never neutral. It's a disruption. It changes the world for those who make it and for those who are found. The road to America was paved with ambition, yes, but it also set the stage for profound cultural and political upheaval. The seeds of global transformation were sown long before Columbus set sail. They were embedded in the very mindset of exploration, in the idea that the unknown was meant to be reached, claimed, and reshaped, and maybe that's the lesson worth taking into our own lives. The road to discovery doesn't only belong to history books, it belongs to anyone willing to step into the uncharted. Most people wait for certainty before moving forward, but history's great shifts came from those who moved first, with incomplete information and an unshakable resolve. The Jeweth century's explorers remind us that the boundaries of our lives, whether physical, mental, or spiritual, are often self-imposed, and they will remain until we dare to cross them. When you think of Columbus staring out at the endless Atlantic, you can almost feel the weight of that choice to stay in safe harbors or to trust the wind and move towards something unseen. And perhaps that is the very heart of discovery, not the moment you arrive, but the decision to leave. The world, like the horizon, always seems far away until you set sail. Like, if the first stage of the discovery of America was defined by the road that led to it, the centuries of preparation, ambition, and technological advance, then the second stage was defined by the human encounter itself, that moment when two worlds, each complete and complex in its own right, came face to face. This is where the story moves from the realm of exploration to the realm of human consequence. And it's here that we begin to see the true weight of what discovery really means. The European arrival in the Americas was not like finding an empty island in the middle of the sea. It was more like two rivers meeting, each carrying its own history, culture, beliefs, and momentum, and when they merged, the waters did not blend smoothly. They collided, sometimes violently. The native civilizations of the Americas, be they the Taíno of the Caribbean, the Mexica of central Mexico, the Inca of the Andes, or countless others, were not simply undiscovered people. They had systems of governance, art, religion, architecture, and agriculture that in many cases rivaled and in some ways surpassed what Europe had achieved. In other words, they were not primitive by default, they were simply different. This is one of the great misconceptions history tends to gloss over when it frames Ichen Sibai Joel Serrar as the beginning of America's story. The Americas had a story long before Europeans arrived, one measured not in decades but in thousands of years. What Columbus's landing initiated was not the creation of something from nothing, but the collision of two trajectories. This collision had layers: economic, cultural, spiritual, and eventually biological. As diseases previously unknown in the Americas spread rapidly and with devastating effect. And we have to resist the temptation to view this meeting only through a lens of moral judgment or romantic nostalgia. It was both extraordinary and tragic. It represented the human capacity for connection across vast distances, but also the human capacity for domination when power is unevenly distributed. The Spanish arrival brought with it steel weapons, firearms, horses, and maritime technology unknown to the indigenous peoples. But it also brought an unshakable belief in the superiority of European ways, and with that came the impulse to reshape, convert, and in many cases destroy the cultures they encountered. From a psychological standpoint, encounters like these expose something fundamental about human beings when two systems of belief meet, and neither has the capacity or willingness to fully understand the other. The stronger will often impose itself on the weaker. This isn't unique to the European conquest of the Americas. It has been a recurring feature of human history. Yet here, because of the scale, the cultural disparity, and the suddenness of the contact, the consequences were particularly irreversible. For the indigenous peoples, the encounter with Europeans was a profound existential shock. Imagine living in a world where the limits of your geography are defined by what you can see, trade for, or hear about from neighboring communities, and then one day, strangers arrive from the horizon, carrying not only goods and weapons, but entirely different conceptions of God, kingship, time, and ownership of land. It would be as if beings from another planet arrived today with technology centuries ahead of our own, insisting that they had the right to reshape our societies because their way was better. That sense of disorientation, coupled with the sudden threat of violence and disease, explains why the balance of power shifted so rapidly in favor of the newcomers. Yet, it is also important to acknowledge that the meeting was not purely one-sided in terms of influence. Europeans took from the Americas not only gold and land, but also crops, techniques, and ideas that would forever alter Europe's trajectory. Potatoes, maize, tomatoes, cacao, these became staples in European diets. Agricultural practices, medicinal knowledge, and even certain governance structures were adapted, directly or indirectly from indigenous models. This was the start of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, a two-way flow of goods, organisms, and ideas that reshaped the world. But again, this exchange was not balanced. It was filtered through the reality of European dominance. When we step back and consider this phase of the discovery of America, we see that it's not just a historical episode, it's a mirror. It reflects what happens whenever human beings, driven by curiosity or ambition, cross into territories that are already inhabited. There is potential for enrichment, but also an almost inevitable risk of exploitation. And this is not just a matter for history, it's a dynamic still at play in the modern world. New technologies, global migration, even the way we engage with cultures online, these are all, in their own ways, moments of contact between different worlds. Whether those encounters lead to mutual growth or destructive domination depends largely on how much respect and humility we bring to the table. If there is a philosophical lesson to draw here, it might be this: discovery is never just about finding something new. It is also about what you do with it once you've found it. The Europeans who landed in the Americas could have approached these civilizations as equals, as partners in knowledge and exchange. Instead, the asymmetry of power and the hunger for wealth led to conquest. That decision shaped, and it is a stark reminder that the way we handle our moments of discovery can determine not just our own fate, but the fate of entire people. History can be a harsh teacher, but it is also a generous one if we are willing to listen. The meeting of Europe and the Americas was a moment of unprecedented potential, both for greatness and for destruction. In the end, both occurred, and that duality is something we must keep in mind whenever we face our own moments of crossing into unknown territory. Because in life, as in history, it's not enough to arrive. The real question is, when you do arrive, whether at a new place, a new idea, or a new relationship, will you approach it with the arrogance of conquest or the humility of understanding? That choice, more than the discovery itself, is what defines your legacy. The third key point in the discovery of America is perhaps the most sobering and the most important to understand, because it's here that we grapple with the reality that discovery is never neutral. It's not simply the act of finding something new. It's the act of redefining what already exists, often according to the worldview and interests of the discoverer. And when that happens, there is always a cost. After the first encounters and exchanges between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the relationship shifted from curiosity. This is a pattern you see repeatedly in human history. The moment something is seen as valuable, the question changes from "what is this?" to "how do we own this?" The discovery, which might have begun in wonder, transforms into a system of dominance, political, economic, cultural. This is not to say that nothing good came from the encounter. There were exchanges of knowledge, technology, crops, and ideas, but the overwhelming weight of the change fell disproportionately on one side. Think of it this way: the discovery of America wasn't like opening a treasure chest. It was more like opening a door to a house that was already full of life, walking in and deciding to rearrange the furniture, repaint the walls, and change the locks without asking the people who lived there. That's what colonization ultimately is, not just exploration, but the imposition of a new order on an old one. What makes this key point philosophically rich is that it forces us to confront the moral complexity of discovery itself. Human beings are explorers by nature. We are wired to seek, to expand, to understand the unknown. But that drive, untempered by humility and respect, easily turns into exploitation. You can see this tension in every great expansion in history, from the conquests of Alexander to the voyages of the Sherwood and Sherlock centuries. We seek the new, but when we find it, we rarely leave it as it is. We change it, sometimes for the better, often for the worse. The Europeans didn't just bring ships, guns, and steel. They brought systems of governance, religion, and economics that were utterly foreign to the Americas. And when those systems clashed with the indigenous way of life, the collision was not resolved through dialogue, but through force. Entire cultures were redefined or erased. Languages disappeared. Belief systems were replaced. Land, which had been seen as communal and sacred, became something that could be owned, bought, and sold. And it's important here to avoid falling into simplistic moral judgments. The men and women who came to the Americas were products of their time. They carried with them the worldview of a Europe that saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization. From their perspective, they were not destroying a world, they were improving it. But from the perspective of the people who lived in that world, what was happening was nothing less than the dismantling of everything they knew. And this is the deeper lesson. Every act of discovery contains within it the seed of transformation, and transformation always has winners and losers. The discovery of America gave rise to a new world order, an interconnected globe, a massive exchange of goods, ideas, and peoples. But it also marked the beginning of centuries of displacement, oppression, and inequality. To understand this key point fully is to recognize that the discovery cannot be separated from responsibility. If you are the one who holds the power to name, to claim, to change, then you also hold the responsibility to weigh the impact of those actions on those who are already there. This isn't just a historical principle, it's a universal one. It applies to nations, to companies, to individuals. Anytime you walk into a space that is not yours and begin to change it, you are in the position of the discoverer. And the question you must ask yourself is, will my presence be a gift or will it be a theft? You know, in the case of the Americas, the answer was complicated, but the overwhelming evidence suggests that for many indigenous peoples, the costs far outweighed the benefits. Their histories were rewritten, their lands transformed, their autonomy stripped away, and yet, remarkably, their resilience persisted. Cultures adapted, resisted, survived. Even today, indigenous voices continue to reclaim their place in the story, challenging the narrative that began in Ichen Sibai Joshurar. So when we speak of the discovery of America, we cannot simply talk about ships and maps and brave explorers. We must also speak of the people who were already here, their civilizations, their losses, and their enduring presence. Because discovery without acknowledgement of those who were discovered is not history, it's propaganda. You know, and here's the point I want you to carry with you. Discovery, in its truest and most noble form, is not about claiming what you've found. It's about seeing it clearly, understanding it deeply, and respecting it enough to let it be. The tragedy of the discovery of America is that it too often failed in this regard, but the lesson it leaves us with is invaluable. When you find something or someone new, resist the instinct to control and instead learn to appreciate. You know, because in the end, the measure of a discovery is not in how much it changes the discoverer's world, but in how well it honors the world it enters. If we forget that, we will repeat the same mistakes on new frontiers with new peoples and in new forms. You know, history gives us this warning not to paralyze us, but to make us wiser. And wisdom demands that the next time we step into the unknown, whether as nations or as individuals, we do so with humility, empathy, and an unwavering respect for what we find. You know, if we can learn that, perhaps we can make discovery not a prelude to conquest, but a doorway to genuine understanding. And that, I think, is worth far more than gold.